Karoline Leavitt destroyed after Jasmine Crockett sues her for $90 million in a courtroom showdown that's shaking all of Washington. What started as political trash talk turns into the legal battle of the decade. Stay till the end to find out the twist that left Karoline speechless and the entire country rethinking the meaning of truth in politics. Like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts on this jaw-dropping real-life drama. They say the fall doesn't come from the punch. It comes from the silence that follows it. That moment when the air gets sucked out of the room, and suddenly, all the noise you've spent your life creating turns on you. That's what it felt like when Representative Karoline Leavitt, once hailed as a rising conservative firebrand with the polish of a PR campaign and the teeth of a pit bull, sat frozen in a Capitol Hill hearing room as Representative Jasmine Crockett calmly read from a single page of a federal lawsuit. One that bore her name, her party's legacy, and a number that made jaws drop across the country. $90 million in damages. This wasn't theater, though it looked like it. It wasn't a TikTok stunt, though it would be clipped into one by morning. It was a moment 5 years in the making, wrapped in the language of constitutional law, campaign finance violations, and perhaps most dangerously, a pattern of defamation that had become currency in the age of culture war politics. But before we get to that explosive day in Washington, before the hashtags and the headlines, you have to understand how the match was lit. Because this wasn't just about two women on opposite ends of the political spectrum. It was about power, race, credibility, and the slow, methodical way that reputations are destroyed. Not by mistakes, but by intention. It began, as so many modern political feuds do, with a single clip. June 3rd. Leavitt was appearing on a far-right digital outlet, nodding along as the host made increasingly inflammatory claims about leftist radicals hijacking the justice system. But it was when Leavitt took the mic that the legal avalanche began to form. People like Jasmine Crockett, she said, without blinking, are actively using their roles in Congress to cover for criminal behavior, funnel dark money to progressive PACs, and silence the voices of patriotic Americans. The host laughed. Leavitt smiled. The comment vanished into the firestorm of daily outrage. Until it didn't. Because Jasmine Crockett, a former civil rights attorney turned congresswoman from Texas, didn't just file it away as another slanderous jab. She saw it as a line that had finally been crossed. A false, reckless, and reputationally lethal allegation made on record, streamed to millions, with the clear intent of harming her public image and political career. But even more critically, it reflected something deeper. A pattern. Over the previous year, Leavitt had mentioned Crockett's name 19 times across TV interviews, tweets, fundraising emails, and public statements, each time casting her as a puppet of globalist interests, a radical race baiter, or worse. Most people saw it as just part of the game. But Crockett wasn't playing anymore. The lawsuit, filed under federal civil statutes governing defamation, reputational injury, and political interference, was more than just a shot across the bow. It was a 127-page dossier of receipts, clips, transcripts, campaign communications, and a damning internal email from a Leavitt staffer urging aggressive messaging targeting Crockett to boost engagement with older donors. The legal language was surgical, but its implications were cultural dynamite. This wasn't just a case. It was a confrontation with a larger American truth, that black women in power are not only targeted more, but expected to tolerate more. And that silence, when weaponized by the powerful, becomes complicity. I sat down with Crockett just 2 days after the suit was filed, in a quiet office far from the lights of the Capitol. She looked like she hadn't slept, but not from fear, from preparation. They keep thinking this is about ego, she told me, slowly removing a yellow post-it from a stack of court documents. It's not. It's about survival. It's about calling out a game that's rigged and saying, enough. That day, I watched her staff cross-reference defamation precedent and high-profile civil suits. They weren't chasing headlines. They were constructing a case with the kind of legal meticulousness that made even the most seasoned reporters uneasy. "You're not just suing a person," I said. "You're suing an entire media ecosystem." Crockett didn't flinch. "Then it's time they know we're not props. We're plaintiffs." Meanwhile, on the other side of D.C., Leavitt's response was as swift as it was familiar. A 2-minute video posted to her X account, formerly Twitter, began with the American flag waving behind her and ended with a familiar phrase. "They want to cancel me because I'm telling the truth." But what lay between those bookends was carefully worded, lawyer-reviewed panic. "I will not be intimidated," she said. "This is a desperate attempt by the radical left to silence conservative voices. I look forward to defeating this baseless lawsuit in court." Except it wasn't baseless. Not even close. Legal experts from across the political spectrum weighed in within hours of the filing, and the consensus was chilling for Leavitt. "There's a clear paper trail," said former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani on MSNBC. "She's not being sued for her political beliefs. She's being sued for knowingly lying repeatedly in a way that could cost someone their career." And then came the part nobody expected, the discovery requests. Because when Crockett's team filed their motion to compel, they weren't just asking for emails and memos. They wanted internal communications between Leavitt's office and major conservative PACs, especially those with histories of funding dark money ad campaigns. They wanted digital logs from her campaign's social media consultants. And most boldly, they demanded testimony from a former Leavitt staffer who had resigned 2 months earlier after an alleged ethical disagreement. Behind closed doors, that's when things started to unravel. Suddenly, conservative news anchors who once championed Leavitt began referring to the suit as a distraction. Major donors went quiet, and whispers began circulating about other potential plaintiffs, Democratic and Republican alike, who had been targeted by similar smear tactics but had lacked the platform or legal team to fight back. Crockett's case was no longer an isolated political clash. It was a potential domino, but the true pivot came 1 week later, when the judge granted an emergency injunction preventing Leavitt or her campaign from making further defamatory statements against Crockett until the matter was resolved. It was a rare, near unprecedented move in an ongoing defamation suit involving elected officials, and it sent a clear message. The court was taking this seriously. In response, Leavitt scheduled a press conference outside the courthouse, flanked by a group of staunch allies, including one senator who is no stranger to controversy himself. But as the cameras flashed and microphones were extended, something unexpected happened. A protester held up a sign just off camera. It read, "You lied." She fought back, and for the first time in weeks, Leavitt seemed rattled. She stuttered through her opening statement, dodged key questions, and abruptly ended the presser after being asked whether she'd received campaign advice from operatives linked to disinformation networks. The footage went viral in a matter of hours, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't. That silence again, that same silence that follows the fall. But this story was far from over, because just 48 hours later, federal documents leaked showing that Leavitt's campaign had received a previously undisclosed $700,000 donation from a shell entity registered in Delaware. One linked to a network of dark money donors previously investigated for illicit campaign funneling. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was a pattern, one that aligned perfectly with the claims in Crockett's lawsuit. And as the nation began to realize this wasn't just political theater, but a blueprint for dismantling toxic misinformation in real time, the stakes changed. Suddenly, this wasn't about Crockett or Leavitt alone. It was about how far a lie can travel when backed by money, microphones, and the false assumption that no one will stand up and say, "Enough." And that was the moment the national conversation shifted. It would only escalate from here. The day after the Shell Company leak broke, the legal tone of the case shifted dramatically. What had begun as a high-profile defamation suit now looked poised to uncover something far more insidious. A shadowy pipeline of misinformation, political opportunism, and financial maneuvering that many had suspected but few had ever proved. Jasmine Crockett's legal team filed an emergency motion to subpoena records not only from Leavitt's campaign, but also from the Federal Election Commission, citing probable violations of campaign finance law. Suddenly, Crockett wasn't just the plaintiff in a civil case. She was potentially triggering a federal investigation. The political world was stunned. Leavitt's legal counsel scrambled to delay discovery deadlines, while her allies in the media tried to recast her as the true victim, a young conservative woman being persecuted for her beliefs by a ruthless liberal machine. But the problem with that narrative was simple. It required people to ignore the facts. And those facts were multiplying by the day. One of the biggest came in the form of a whistleblower. I remember sitting in a DC cafe, watching the tremor ripple through my encrypted journalist group chat. Someone inside Leavitt's camp is flipping. The anonymous tipster claimed to be a former digital strategist who had worked closely with Leavitt's communications team during the midterms. They didn't want money. They didn't want fame. What they wanted, they told me through a scrambled phone call, was to stop feeling like a co-conspirator in something fundamentally wrong. Within 48 hours, Crockett's team had deposed the former staffer, under seal, for their protection. But the details quickly leaked. Emails detailing deliberate coordination between campaign messaging and independent conservative super PACs, strategy memos labeling Crockett as a high ROI target for culture war framing, and internal Slack messages discussing how best to manipulate racial optics to frame Crockett as both militant and corrupt. It was sickening, and it was real. By week's end, Crockett's legal team amended their complaint, now citing coordinated defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and campaign conspiracy. The $90 million figure, once considered bombastic, was beginning to look like a low estimate. Meanwhile, the court allowed depositions to move forward at an accelerated pace due to what Judge Miriam Lopez called the potential for ongoing reputational and institutional harm. And still, Leavitt remained defiant, at least in public. Behind the scenes, her team was fracturing. 2 senior advisors abruptly resigned, citing irreconcilable ethical concerns. One Republican strategist who had previously praised Leavitt's tenacity told Politico anonymously that she had become a liability too radioactive to stand beside. But the most surreal moment came on a Sunday morning, during a live panel on CBS's Face the Nation. Jasmine Crockett appeared alongside a constitutional law professor from Georgetown, breaking down the implications of the case not just for her, but for the broader question of truth in American political discourse. "We're not just talking about hurt feelings or political mudslinging," Crockett said, looking directly into the camera. "We're talking about a system that incentivizes lies because it believes those lies will never cost you anything. Well, this time, there's a price tag." The professor nodded. "If this goes to trial, and all signs suggest it will, it could become the most significant defamation case involving elected officials since Hustler versus Falwell. But unlike Falwell, this isn't parody. This is a sustained and deliberate campaign of misinformation." The impact of that interview rippled across the country. Americans, exhausted by the non-stop chaos of partisan warfare, suddenly saw in Crockett a model of accountability that didn't scream or meme or threaten. She wasn't trying to humiliate her opponent. She was forcing her to reckon with the consequences of her words. It was an act of grace in a system addicted to spectacle. But that grace had razor-sharp edges, and now they were drawing blood. 3 days later, federal auditors confirmed that Leavitt's campaign had failed to report multiple transactions over the $200 reporting threshold. That revelation, seemingly minor, raised red flags for FEC investigators and validated Crockett's broader claims. This wasn't sloppiness. It was systematic. Then came the footage, an investigative report from ProPublica, working in tandem with Crockett's legal team, unearthed internal video from a digital fundraising summit Leavitt attended just 8 months earlier. In it, a political strategist could be heard coaching candidates on how to frame black women legislators as elitist and corrupt to trigger high-value donor engagement. The footage didn't name Crockett, but a whiteboard in the background did. Her name, in red Sharpie, circled and underlined. Crockett, target heavy, high reward must neutralize. That clip would become the most watched political video on YouTube that month. It wasn't just confirmation of bias, it was the blueprint. And it proved that Leavitt's attacks weren't born of ideology, but of strategy. She didn't believe Crockett was corrupt. She believed that saying so would get her attention. And it worked, until it backfired. But what made this exposé so powerful wasn't the data dump or the legalese. It was what Crockett did next. She held a press conference not on Capitol Hill, but in Houston, surrounded by a group of young black women, law students, first-time voters, and community activists. She didn't talk about winning. She talked about surviving. She spoke about being the subject of online death threats, of seeing her face photoshopped on mugshots, of being called everything but her name, and then showing up the next morning to vote, to legislate, to speak truth in rooms built to ignore her. "I didn't sue because I'm angry," she said, voice cracking. "I sued because I'm still here." It was, for many Americans, the most human moment in a case that had been defined by its political chessboard. It reminded people that behind every scandal was a person, one who bleeds, fears, and fights. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about just legal precedent. It was about cultural transformation. Still, Leavitt was far from done. In a rare televised interview on Fox, she claimed she was being targeted as part of a coordinated assault on conservative women. She suggested the lawsuit was being funded by Soros-backed groups, though she provided no evidence. When asked directly whether she regretted calling Crockett corrupt, she paused, then said, "I regret nothing, but the cracks were widening." New court filings revealed that her legal defense fund was being quietly propped up by donors who themselves were under investigation for tax fraud. And then came the final nail. For now, a statement from the Department of Justice confirming that multiple communications between Leavitt's campaign and a PAC under federal scrutiny would be reviewed for potential violations of the Campaign Reform Act. For the first time in the case, Leavitt's legal team requested a delay. And for the first time in public, she looked unsure. But this story was only getting louder, because behind the courtroom drama and the media spin, the real impact was starting to settle across the nation. The idea that maybe, just maybe, there are still consequences for lying. That accountability isn't a partisan issue, but a civic one. That the truth, when spoken with clarity and courage, can still shake the halls of power. And Jasmine Crockett? She wasn't done yet. By the time fall session began in Washington, the suit was no longer a legal footnote. It was the story. Journalists weren't just covering it. They were reorganizing their beats around it. Politico launched a dedicated vertical. MSNBC ran nightly breakdowns. Even the more cautious outlets like NPR and Reuters had to acknowledge what was unfolding wasn't just a defamation case. It was a systemic rupture. And right in the center stood two women who had come to represent the opposite poles of modern American discourse. Karoline Leavitt, the firebrand provocateur who built a brand on weaponized misinformation, and Jasmine Crockett, the quiet legal tactician who chose not to yell back, but to sue. And make no mistake, by now, Crockett's case had evolved into something far bigger than either woman. The third amended complaint, filed in federal court and publicly released with deliberate precision, outlined a web of deceit so intricate it read like a crime thriller. It named not only Karoline Leavitt, but also 5 affiliated political organizations, 2 media consultants, and a digital analytics firm known for its controversial micro-targeting strategies. Each was implicated in an intentional and coordinated effort to fabricate false narratives with the intent to defame, intimidate, and financially harm Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. It wasn't speculative. It was evidentiary. Appendix C alone contained nearly 700 pages of documents. Many of them previously unreleased emails, strategy memos, and internal Slack screenshots. In one particularly damning exchange, a consultant advised Leavitt's team, "Use the crooked Crockett line again in the closing reel. It's polling high with suburban males over 55. Include something about race baiting. Nothing explicit, just enough to trigger engagement." Another suggested running split A/B tests between different versions of attack graphics. One with Crockett's face in standard grayscale, and one with a photoshopped red filter that evoked mugshot imagery. The latter outperformed the former by 37%, and was promptly pushed to multiple platforms. This wasn't just political messaging, it was character assassination by algorithm. And that distinction mattered a lot, because the lawsuit wasn't just about protecting one congresswoman's reputation. It was about whether the courts were willing to hold political operatives accountable for dehumanizing campaigns disguised as free speech. The constitutional debate was heating up, and legal scholars across the country were weighing in. Was this protected political commentary? Or was it malicious defamation dressed in red, white, and blue? The answer, increasingly, leaned toward the latter. And that shift had real consequences. 3 conservative PACs named in the complaint began scrubbing their websites of any content referencing Crockett. Leavitt's campaign stopped all social media activity for 72 hours, an eternity in the digital war zone. Donors went silent. Allies grew scarce. Even Tucker Carlson, once a reliable ally, threw a backhanded jab during an interview. If you can't tell the truth without being sued, maybe you should check whether what you're calling truth is just venom. Behind the scenes, the strain on Leavitt was beginning to show. Sources close to her campaign described a woman unraveling under pressure. One staffer, who asked not to be named, said she was lashing out, paranoid, convinced this was some kind of coordinated takedown. Another described all-nighters filled with crisis management meetings, frantic calls to donors, and repeated revisions of public statements, none of which managed to land. And then came the deposition. The court granted Crockett's request to depose Leavitt under oath, an unprecedented move, considering both women were sitting members of Congress. But Judge Lopez was clear. No individual, regardless of title or office, is above the requirements of discovery when named as a defendant in a civil suit involving potentially malicious conduct. Leavitt tried to delay. She failed, and on a cool October morning, in a sealed conference room at a federal courthouse in D.C., the deposition began. What followed was, according to those present, a complete disaster. Multiple times, Leavitt invoked the Fifth Amendment, not to avoid criminal self-incrimination, since the case was civil, but as a deflection tactic advised by counsel. Her answers were evasive, her tone combative. When presented with internal emails suggesting she approved defamatory language personally, she claimed she didn't recall. When shown video clips of her public statements, contradicted by campaign memos, she accused the plaintiff's legal team of selective editing. But the most damning moment came when she was asked directly, "Do you believe Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is corrupt?" A simple yes or no. She paused, and then, for the first time since the suit began, she broke eye contact with the attorneys, looked down at the table, and whispered, "I don't know anymore." That moment, leaked through transcripts within hours, was a turning point. It went viral not because it was loud, but because it was real. It punctured the armor of righteous indignation Leavitt had worn for months. For a fleeting second, she sounded like a person facing the weight of her own narrative. And that changed everything. Donors began pulling funds. GOP leaders stopped defending her in public. A conservative think tank rescinded its offer for Leavitt to headline their fall conference. The ground beneath her feet was eroding fast. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett remained composed. She made no grand declarations, no victory laps. When asked by CNN if she felt vindicated, she simply said, "This was never about me. This was about the line, and what happens when you cross it." But privately, those close to her described a woman more driven than ever. She wasn't just fighting back. She was building a roadmap. Her team began consulting with civil rights lawyers across the country about launching a legal network specifically for women of color in public office, many of whom endure constant, coordinated defamation campaigns with no resources to respond. The project, tentatively titled the Integrity Initiative, was already attracting seed funding. She had turned the smear into a movement. And as this movement gained traction, so did the public reckoning. Editorials from the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and even the Wall Street Journal began to acknowledge the lawsuit's significance. "This isn't cancel culture," wrote conservative columnist Andrew Petty. "This is consequence culture. And if we're going to preserve the First Amendment, we need to recognize that free speech doesn't mean freedom from accountability." Meanwhile, in a twist no one saw coming, another member of Congress, this time a Republican woman, filed a separate complaint alleging she, too, had been used as a clickbait foil in Leavitt's internal messaging strategy. The political class was watching the levee crack, and for some, the pressure was too much. And then came the bombshell, an anonymous submission to the court, verified and authenticated, revealed that Karoline Leavitt's team had, on at least 2 occasions, paid a third-party digital contractor to manipulate search results involving Jasmine Crockett. The goal? Suppress links to her legal accomplishments and amplify links that framed her as radical and untrustworthy. It was, in effect, algorithmic character assassination. This, Crockett's lawyers argued, moved the case beyond defamation. It was cyber harassment. The judge agreed to expand the case scope. New subpoenas were issued. Tech firms were brought in. The Department of Justice sent a formal letter of interest to the court, signaling possible criminal review of digital interference. The room had gotten darker. And now, the question was no longer, will Leavitt survive this politically? It was, will she face federal charges? But even amid all this escalation, Jasmine Crockett remained strangely silent in the public eye. Her last tweet was 3 days old. Her most recent speech on the House floor was procedural. She had gone quiet, not out of retreat, but strategy, because something much bigger was coming. The final hearing before trial had been scheduled. Witness lists were being finalized, and among them, a name no one expected had appeared in bold type, under seal until confirmed. A former sitting member of Congress, a conservative, and a witness for the plaintiff. The sealed witness name sent shockwaves through Washington's legal circles. Whispered speculations floated from think tank lunches to Capitol elevators. It's someone from inside the party. Some said it was a disgraced former representative looking for redemption. Others thought it might be a moderate Republican, one who'd silently endured the party's drift toward toxic spectacle and finally snapped. No one had answers, but the fact that the witness was testifying for Jasmine Crockett sent a very clear message. The levee had broken, and not everyone was content to drown in silence. 3 days before the scheduled pretrial hearing, the name became public. Representative Adam Kinzinger, a man who had defied his own party during the January 6th hearings. A veteran, a Republican, and now, an ally in a lawsuit centered not on partisanship, but on truth. The legal world gasped. Cable news exploded. But behind closed doors, Crockett's team simply nodded. They'd known for months. Kinzinger's statement, released the same day the court confirmed his testimony, was quietly devastating. The attacks leveled against Congresswoman Crockett by Representative Leavitt were not ideological. They were strategic. And they weren't just political. They were personal, targeted, and knowingly false. I watched as members of my own party were encouraged to dehumanize opponents for fundraising gain. I watched truth become optional. I am testifying because I believe this case is not about a political spat. It is about whether we still value facts, and whether we protect those who dare to speak them. The courtroom had grown larger than the law. The day of the hearing, media flooded the federal courthouse. Streets were cordoned off. Protesters and supporters alike gathered, signs in hand. Accountability isn't cancel culture. Protect black women in power. Free speech is not equal to free lies. Inside, Crockett sat still, unshaken, dressed in a deep navy suit, hands clasped, her legal team flanking her like a quiet army. Karoline Leavitt arrived late. She avoided eye contact with reporters. For the first time, she entered the building without cameras trailing her by design. Her confidence, once armor-plated, seemed to have fractured into practiced glances and terse whispers. And then Adam Kinzinger took the stand. Sworn in under oath, he answered the judge's questions calmly, methodically. He was not there to offer hearsay. He was there to provide corroboration. His testimony detailed a 2023 closed-door meeting of conservative operatives where Crockett's name had been floated as a high-yield culture war antagonist. He confirmed that Leavitt's team had been present. He described hearing with chilling clarity. One strategist say, "We need another Ilhan Omar, but make her more American-sounding so the pushback doesn't look racist." The courtroom fell silent. And for the first time, the narrative shifted entirely. This wasn't a defamation case anymore. It was a reckoning. Kinzinger's testimony pulled back the curtain on a strategy many had long suspected, but few could prove. That black women in Congress were not simply debated on policy. They were selected, targeted, and branded for cultural exploitation. It wasn't political combat. It was narrative engineering. And now, a Republican had put it on record. Outside, the storm only grew. That evening, a joint investigation by The Atlantic and The Guardian revealed internal budget documents from one of the PACs named in the lawsuit. Line items included dedicated ad spend for what they called Rep. Crockett smear rotation, a monthly campaign designed to flood search engines and social platforms with misleading headlines and ideological bait involving crime, immigration, and campaign donations. The documents weren't leaked. They were subpoenaed. The judge immediately allowed them into evidence. In a rare statement from the bench, Judge Lopez addressed both legal teams and the press. This court has seen patterns that suggest intentional malice, strategic deception, and a deeply concerning disregard for truth in the public sphere. The First Amendment is not a shield for lies made with intent to destroy. It is a guardrail for democracy, not a weapon. The line was quoted across every major network within the hour. But what happened next made even seasoned court watchers lose their breath. One of the tech firms subpoenaed in the case, Dataverse Consulting, a little-known data mining outfit based in Virginia, quietly filed a disclosure with the court. It included a cache of messages between their team and Leavitt's campaign. Among them, payment confirmations for data sets, link suppression services, and behavioral targeting programs aimed at voters who respond negatively to confident, non-white women. The internal language was clinical, soulless, algorithmic racism, but it confirmed Crockett's team's most aggressive claim. This wasn't about a single defamatory comment. It was a machinery of defamation, oiled by money and big data, built to collapse one woman's credibility in service of engagement metrics. And now, under oath, they'd admitted it. By this point, public sentiment had shifted dramatically. Leavitt's most ardent defenders had fallen quiet. Her campaign website disabled donations. She hadn't posted on social media in 48 hours. In political time, that's a decade. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett gave a single interview. Just one, Sitting across from journalist Joy Reid, she didn't spike the football. She didn't talk about Leavitt by name. Instead, she did something that shook viewers more than any attack ad ever could. She talked about her mother. "My mom cleaned houses for 30 years, Crockett said softly. "She used to tell me, the lies they tell about us will travel farther than our truth, so you better make sure your truth has legs strong enough to chase them down. This isn't about revenge. It's about making sure my mother's daughter didn't sit here and let people lie on her without fighting back." That clip went viral. It was featured in classrooms, played in community centers, shared by celebrities, and slowly something shifted, not just in Washington, but in the American psyche. For years, political cruelty had been a sport, a marketing strategy, and too often, it had been absorbed by the public as just another part of the game. But Crockett refused to play. She didn't clap back. She sued. She turned character assassination into civil litigation. And she forced a nation addicted to drama to reckon with decency. And then, the biggest twist yet. Karoline Leavitt's legal team filed a sealed motion. But the press got wind of it. They weren't asking for dismissal. They were asking for settlement mediation. For weeks, Leavitt had said she would fight this to the end. Now, her lawyers were signaling she wanted out, that she couldn't risk discovery going further, that she might not survive what came next. But the irony? Crockett didn't want money. She'd already pledged any potential award to civil rights legal aid organizations. This wasn't about a payday. This was about precedent. And so the judge denied mediation. "We are too far down the path," she ruled. "This must be seen through to completion." One final trial date was set. One more chapter to go. And as America watched, holding its breath, two women prepared for the conclusion of a battle that had come to symbolize everything broken, and everything still worth defending, in the public square. The courtroom was at capacity, not just legally, but emotionally. The final day of the Crockett versus Leavitt trial had become the most anticipated civic moment of the year. A national Rorschach test for truth, accountability, and the direction of American politics. From law students in Harvard auditoriums to grandmothers watching C-SPAN in South Carolina, the country wasn't just watching, it was listening, because something rare had happened in a nation dulled by scandal fatigue and partisan theater. The people had begun to care again about the quiet mechanics of truth. The trial's closing arguments were scheduled for 9 a.m. Reporters lined the sidewalks by 5:30. Court officers added additional magnetometers. Lines stretched around the block. Inside, Jasmine Crockett sat in the front row beside her counsel, dressed not for war, but for dignity. She wore a simple white blouse and a black blazer, calm, composed, almost priestly in posture. She didn't glance toward Karoline Leavitt once, not out of disdain, but resolve. This was no longer personal. It was historical. The lead counsel for Crockett stood first. His voice didn't boom. It didn't perform. Instead, it pressed into the silence with surgical grace. This case is not about political differences. This is about deliberate harm. It is about a machine of defamation, coded, funded, executed, not just against one woman, but against the very idea that facts should matter more than fundraising. The defense would like you to believe that what Representative Leavitt did was business as usual. And they are right. It was. And that is the problem. It has become usual, routine, expected, but the law is not routine. The law is where we draw the line between what we tolerate and what we reject. Today, you have the opportunity to redraw that line. He ended with a quote from James Baldwin. "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Then came Leavitt's defense. Her lawyer, a seasoned operator with decades in First Amendment litigation, played the hits: freedom of speech, political expression, the right to critique public figures. He called the suit a dangerous attempt to weaponize the courts to silence dissent. He tried to frame Crockett as thin-skinned, opportunistic. He even attempted to introduce evidence of Crockett's own sharp retorts on social media, none of which were defamatory or fabricated, but framed as mean-spirited. The argument felt outdated, weak, misdirected, and when the jury recessed for deliberation, even the most neutral observers could see the tide had already turned. 6 hours later, they returned. Unanimous verdict. Liable. All counts. Karoline Leavitt was found legally responsible for malicious defamation, intentional infliction of reputational harm, and coordinated digital harassment with actual malice, the gold standard of civil burden in cases involving public figures. The jury awarded $87 million in damages, citing punitive necessity, but Crockett's legal team declined to collect more than $1 in personal compensation. Instead, they redirected the award, per Crockett's pretrial declaration, to establish the Truth Defense Fund, a nonpartisan legal organization designed to support public servants, particularly women of color, targeted by organized smear campaigns. The announcement of the verdict didn't trigger cheers. It triggered tears. In courtrooms, in classrooms, in homes. Because for once, the system didn't just react. It responded. With clarity. With finality. With truth. Karoline Leavitt left the courtroom through a side exit. Her legal team issued a brief statement vowing to appeal. But even her most loyal donors knew the war had been lost. Within 48 hours, 3 PACs severed ties. Her podcast was suspended. A major publisher quietly pulled a proposed book deal. And her personal social media platforms were restricted for repeated disinformation violations. But it wasn't cancellation. It was consequence. Jasmine Crockett's response was characteristically quiet. She didn't give a speech. She didn't mock. She stood before the courthouse, faced the cameras, and delivered one short statement. I did not fight this battle for revenge. I fought it so the next woman behind me wouldn't have to. Let this verdict be a reminder that facts are not negotiable, and neither is dignity. She turned, took her mother's hand, who had flown in from Texas, and walked back down the marble steps, not as a victor, but as a vindication. What followed in the weeks ahead wasn't some sweeping political revolution. It was slower, but deeper. Congressional committees quietly began reviewing rules around digital defamation by elected officials. Several high-profile campaigns hired ethics advisors. Major social media platforms released new transparency tools for political ads. A half-dozen sitting representatives across both parties publicly announced support for Crockett's new legal initiative. And the American public, perhaps most importantly, began to notice the difference between criticism and cruelty. Jasmine Crockett's approval rating spiked, not because she owned her opponent, but because she showed restraint, discipline, and strength in a country tired of screaming and starving for sanity. She became a cultural lodestar, not a celebrity, but a compass. And her victory wasn't just legal. It was generational. Young activists cited her case in debates. High school students wrote essays about the trial. Law schools restructured defamation modules to include Crockett versus Leavitt as a modern landmark. And through it all, she stayed the same, focused, humble, forward-facing. As for Leavitt, her political career didn't end in a courtroom. It ended in a mirror. One where the reflection no longer blinked back. Not because she lost a case, but because the tools she used to rise, venom, spectacle, manufactured grievance, had finally lost their value. The algorithm had changed. The country had changed. And she never saw it coming. Months later, a journalist asked Crockett what she felt when she heard the verdict read aloud. She paused, smiled. I felt like my mother's voice was louder than theirs finally. And that, perhaps, is what the truth ultimately sounds like. Not a roar, but a whisper that keeps standing, long after the noise is gone.